Hey there, it's been a while. I've been pondering making this video for a long time, and it's going to be a long one, so I think we should just get into it. I'm going to start with some background for those not familiar with the name Stuart Reges. I'm also going to drop a content warning right off the bat for most, if not all, major issues regarding discrimination against women and minority groups. First, let's start with who is Stuart Reges. Stuart is one of the primary intro computer science professors at the University of Washington. He began his career at Stanford, where he was a graduate student in 1979 and an eventual member of the staff. There, he helped create the undergraduate computer science major and won many teaching awards in the process. He fostered an undergraduate TA program there that is continuing till this day, and while at Stanford, he advocated for gay rights and drug reform. He was eventually fired for a protest regarding the latter in 1991, and after that, he was a representative for the Libertarian Party for a short time. After his firing from Stanford, before creating computer science undergraduate programs in the University of Arizona from 1996 to 2004, then the University of Washington from 2004 to present day. As a former student, I personally think he's a great teacher inside the classroom and has won many awards that say as much in his time at UW. Now, a second good question, why am I making a video on him? As a former intro computer science TA for almost 3 years working in the program he built, I feel closely connected with both the program and the TAs and students that run and take those classes respectively. Stuart has been renowned for the last several years for his controversial articles released on a third-party website called Quillette. These articles cover topics such as women in coding, black students in education equity, and indigenous land rights, among other topics regarding diversity and inclusion. Up to this point in my life, being a TA has been one of the most influential experiences I've had. It means a lot to me, and it's fostered a lot more growth in me, both professionally and personally, than any other job I've had by a long shot. Being able to provide a non-anonymous and public rebuttal of these articles may provide some insight to those who are generally unaware of the situation, as well as kind of act as an archive for refutation of these articles, because a lot of the rebuttals of them have been very separate individual pieces on each individual article whenever they're released. This is going to be one on all of them. All at once. I'll try to keep it entertaining too. My conservative guess for runtime is like 2 hours. So if I'm going to make like an Avengers Endgame-esque video with all these articles, I'm going to try to at least entertain myself if it doesn't entertain anyone else. The last valid question I want to address is why now? Why am I doing this now? I've been graduated for 2 years now, so it's a valid question, and it's one that I want to answer. Privately, I've always had conversations with people close to me about these articles, as they were, a lot of them were published while I was a TA and a student. But I've always felt like I needed to do something more. Personally, while I disagreed with Stuart quietly, I never felt I had the confidence or active knowledge to publicly push back until recently. Learning is an active process, and I continue to learn every day. But I feel that recently I've achieved a level of confidence and knowledge, as well as researching ability to give you these refutations the time and care that they deserve and need. I also happen to be in between jobs right now, which affords me a lot more time to focus on this project than I otherwise would have. Full disclosure, by the way, before we get started, I wrote this part last because I knew I could get all the information from an autobiographical website he has. And as a result, I didn't actually know that he has other articles on other third-party websites such as Campus Reform. So this video will only cover those Quillette articles that he's written. One more thing before we jump in, I'll be discussing these articles and refuting them as I've already discussed, as I believe most of them to be at best misguided and at worst incorrect. As a straight cis white male, I'd also like to acknowledge that I have a lot of privilege in discussions of diversity. Women and minority leaders are often seen much more negatively when discussing these topics, according to Harvard Business Review. So keep that in mind. Please direct your attention to women, black, and indigenous people's thoughts on topics discussed in the following 6 articles, including some perspectives I will share within this video. And these people can provide more insight into the harm that's been caused by these opinions than I ever could. With that, let's begin. We're already failing. There weren't enough W's. I'd use an M for the war. Now, I'm admittedly least interested in dissecting this article, as it's less focused on computer science, program-related discussion, and more focused on general politics. Nevertheless, there are some interesting points to discuss here, plus it would be weird if I just ignored one article. This article revolves around a conservative rally called Patriot Prayer. which took place on UW campus grounds in early February 2018, and a counter-protest that eventually ensued at the event. Here we can actually gain some much-needed insight into Stuart's political leanings, which will be insightful for the next articles we dissect. To briefly summarize Stuart's position on this article, he attempts to position himself in the middle of the Patriot Prayer attendees and counter-protesters, but whether he accomplishes this is up for debate. He discusses how both sides accused the other of saying one thing but meaning something else. I'll read this paragraph in full for proper context. Meaningful dialogue requires at least a modicum of respect, so it's disheartening to see both sides accusing the other of saying one thing but meaning something else. Patriot Prayer denounced racism, but the protesters claimed that they were racist no matter what they said. The protesters were mostly anti-Trump progressives with a hint of socialist agenda, and yet Joey Gibson described them as communists infused with Marxist ideology, who denied at the same time and denounced Seattle for various sins, including electing a communist to its city council. This statement alone, I believe, does a fine enough job positioning himself in between the two sides. Through the rest of the article, although a subjective measurement, he seems to somewhat equally defend protesters from the claim of being communists and rally attendees from the claim of being racist. That being said, in this article, he seems to imply an equivalence between the negative connotation of racism and the negative connotation of communism, which I personally heavily disagree with. It's vilifying an ideology at the same level as vilifying actions which explicitly and implicitly hurt specific groups of people simply for existing should not be on the same level. The only other thing I believe is interesting to address is the appearance of Stuart's centrism versus the actual arguments he makes to defend both sides. As I mentioned, he made the same amount of arguments for either side, but qualitatively they are much different. Let's look at each of them. First, the claim that protesters were communists he defends in the following way. Patriot Prayer, meanwhile, had their own cartoonish characterization of the other side. Joey Gibson described UW as, quote, a campus that is filled with wannabe communists, that is filled with professors, that is constantly trying to preach communism and Marxist ideology, and yet deny it at the same time. One protester was holding up a Soviet flag, but Gibson came closer to the mark when he described the campus as being filled with Bernie supporters who are flirting with socialism. More of a metaphysical shrug than a defense, in my opinion. This defense boils down to they're actually mostly socialists, not communists. Let's compare this to his defense of the claim that the rally attendees were racist. That didn't stop the opposition from deciding what Patriot Prayer stands for. The most common and most inaccurate complaint was that they are racist and affiliated with white nationalists. Quote, say it loud, say it clear, racists are not welcome here, end quote, the protesting crowd chanted along with. Quote, racist bigots, anti-gay, Nazi bigots, go away, end quote. A protester interviewed by Como 4 News opined that the, quote, make America great again, end quote, hats worn by Patriot Prayer really mean, quote, make America white again, end quote, and accused the rally organizers and attendees of racial dog whistling. Additionally, I'd like to point out Stuart did some cursory research on Patriot Prayer, looking up their Facebook page. He mentions this earlier, although not directly related to defending accusations of racism. I still believe it is an important quote to point out nonetheless. But I couldn't tell at first why Patriot Prayer would generate so much hostility. They do not have a public webpage, and they do not list any principles or issues on their Facebook page. Their leader, Joey Gibson, makes many statements, but it is not clear whether he is speaking as an individual or describing the goals of the group. Their most common themes are a desire for smaller government, support for Donald Trump, and fighting for free speech. Stuart's pushback against accusations of racism revolve around saying that nothing said at the rally indicated racism or support for white nationalism, as if he's looking for some big neon sign that says, I am racist on it. Very few people, especially public figures, are going to outwardly say that they're racist at this point in history. Racism comes from two primary sources. First, internal biases resulting in mistreatment of certain groups, either intentional or unintentional. This is a blanket statement for day-to-day, person-to-person racism mostly. Second, direct actions taken to either directly or indirectly take power away from certain underrepresented groups. These can be seen in actions like gerrymandering, which, while performed by both parties, is predominantly done by Republicans rather than Democrats, and ends up making the votes of minorities less valuable than they otherwise would be, and flat tax rates, where every individual is required to pay an exact percentage for tax, disproportionately affecting the poor, who are disproportionately Black and Hispanic. Determining whether someone is racist cannot and should not be determined by whether or not they outwardly say racist things or say they are a racist. For example, I personally believe most people, if not all people, are racist or have racist tendencies, as everyone holds their own internal biases, whether recognized or not by that individual, through the place they grew up, the people they associated with, and education and media that can create these biases. What determines whether you're anti-racist or not is whether you actively recognize and combat those biases. The term racist has moved beyond externally and outwardly expressed racism, and it's important to recognize that when discussing this topic. So, from this article, we can see that Stuart tries to in some way posture himself as a third-party bystander, when many of his arguments lean on the conservative side. Now, I don't think Stuart would deny that he is conservative, which will be more evident as we continue reading these articles, but in that case, you can't simultaneously posture yourself as a third-party independent bystander. Like I said, not spending much time here. We've got some substantial issues to discuss, including this next article. That one we had enough W's for, so thank you. I would argue that this is Stuart's most famous article, and definitely the one that caused the most discussion. Stuart wrote this article off the back of the news of James Damore's firing from Google as a result of his disparaging of the company's efforts to hire more women and close the gender gap in an internal memo. Some lowlights from Damore's article include blaming, quote, neuroticism, higher anxiety, lower stress tolerance, and more openness directed towards feelings and aesthetics rather than ideas, end quote, for the lack of women in tech. Stuart's authoring of this article revolved around his struggle to understand why Damore's statements caused such outrage. You might imagine that a diversity would be more open to discussing his ideas, but my experience suggests otherwise. For the last 10 months, I've been discussing this issue at the Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering, where I work. I have tried to understand why Damore's opinions generated such anger and have struggled to decide what I want to do in response. As a result of my attempts to discuss this, our mailing list known as Diversity Allies is now a moderated list to prevent, quote, nuanced and potentially hurtful discussion, end quote. Instead, I have been encouraged to participate in face-to-face meetings that have often been tense, but which have helped me to understand where others are coming from. Piggybacking on the sentiment, Stuart gives way to his hypothesis. So let me go once more onto the breach by stating publicly that I believe that women are less likely than men to want to major in computer science and less likely to pursue a career as a software engineer, and that this difference between men and women accounts for most of the gender gap we see in computer science degree programs and in Silicon Valley companies. Let's break this down into Claim A and Claim B. Claim A, I believe that women are less likely than men to want to major in computer science and less likely to pursue a career as a software engineer. Then Claim B, Claim A is the cause of most of the gender gap we see in computer science programs and in Silicon Valley. For the purpose of this discussion, I'll be focusing more on Claim B than Claim A. I believe there are a lot of factors why there's a gender gap in computer science, and I'll be discussing some of those factors which may provide some inherent refutation to Claim A without needing a specific argument against it. The next several paragraphs detail his accomplishments as a champion of using undergraduate TAs, and an excellence in promoting women and undergraduate computing award in 2015 by the National Center for Women and Information Technology. I only mention this because it acts as a preface to the meat of his argument, and whether he intended it or not, it is a defensive measure that he can point to in order to potentially justify his opinions to himself and his audience. In short, I recognize this as an appeal to authority and subsequently dismiss it as such. Towards the end of this section, he mentions that half of the women in our undergraduate major are interest changers, which means they weren't intending to apply to the major when they started our first course. For men, the figure is closer to 20%, so there is a big gender gap. A theme that emerges from some of Stuart's articles is introducing data and statistics and then choosing not to explore why they may be, instead opting to just say that they showed that his point is correct. In other words, he uses the statistics to justify his argument instead of looking at the statistics and trying to explain why they are the way they are, or trying to find reasons for why they were constructed. So that is the perspective that I will be coming from. This is a significant gap and has a lot of interesting implications. 20% of men change their interests compared to 50% of women. Why could this be? Does it imply a lack of availability or capability to explore the field before a college setting? Let's break this disparity down a little bit more. As of 2021, 51% of high schoolers have a computer science program, with a portion of those 51% not having dedicated computer science teachers. As an example of what I mean there, my high school computer science teacher was actually a physics teacher. As Forbes points out, just 51% of US high schools offer computer science, according to a report published today by a consortium of industry bodies, teachers, and nonprofits. While this figure is a big improvement on the 35% of 3 years ago, and is up from last year's 47% despite the disruption to schools caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, it is a huge shortfall on the ambition to give every student the opportunity to learn to code. They go on to discuss how even within these currently existing programs, we are seeing drops in interest in women compared to men from elementary school to high school. Male students are more likely to continue with computer science into high school, while female students make up almost half, 49%, of elementary school students taking computer science. That drops to 44% in middle schools and just 31% in high school. So if 51% of high schools have a computer science program, and the population of those classes is 31% women, we're left with roughly 15% of women having a secondary school experience with computer science before college. This means that roughly 85% of women haven't had a substantial experience with computer science before college. Now there's another part of this statistic that we should break down. Forbes notes that male students are more likely to continue with computer science into high school. A detailed report made by Florida Gulf Coast University and the University of Colorado gives several reasons for why female students are less engaged with computer science. Here are some, for example. 1. Poor preparation and lack of encouragement in STEM subjects. 2. Lack of substantial role models. 3. Salary differences and low status. And 4. Bias and discrimination in hiring and advancement of women. Sound familiar? This report was written in 2007, and these points are still active battles in both education institutions and the industry as a whole. While salary differences have been reduced, they still exist. While bias and discrimination in the hiring and advancement of women has been reduced, it still exists. Lack of substantial role models has only gotten worse as the percentage of women in computer science has decreased from 37% to 22% from 1995 to 2022. That's the year we're in. It's 2022. The report cites other reasons as well that we don't have time to fully get into, but I'll leave the link in the description. All in all, this doesn't sound like an issue that has been leveled out or deserving of any less attention as Stuart would suggest. His next section seeks to explore the difference between equity and equality, where he associates equality with the equality of opportunity and equity with the equality of outcome. He further describes equity supporters here. The equity agenda is concerned with outcomes. Its proponents don't demand equal outcomes, but instead use unequal outcomes as evidence that there is more work to be done. So unless we reach perfect gender parity, they will continue to argue for more diversity programs for women. Now, Stuart is trying to make the argument that we've reached our peak in terms of representation of women in computer science. His argument against those continuing to fight for opportunities for women is that they won't stop until there's perfect gender parity. This when will it end or when will it stop argument is a fairly weak one, because the answer is it ends somewhere. If you're trying to argue for equity initiatives to be halted, you've got to have a better argument than they're never going to stop. The reality is there are still ongoing issues that discriminate against and discourage women from making progress towards the field of computer science, some of which I've already pointed out. Let's work on trying to resolve the existing issues first. Then we can evaluate from there what we want to do, instead of just declaring us dead in the water. Next, he says he tries to discuss Demore at UW and said he found it, quote, almost impossible. I asked how we could make someone like Demore feel welcome in our community. The pushback was intense. My question was labeled an inflammatory example, and my comments were described as hurtful to women. When I mentioned that perhaps we could invite Demore to speak at UW, a faculty member responded, quote, if he comes here, we'll hurt him, end quote. She was joking, but the sentiment was clear. Is this how you tried to discuss Demore? I think it's perfectly valid to discuss his ideas seeking to understand them and whether they're valid, as you mentioned several times. That's what academia is about. But asking how we can make him feel welcome in the community or invite him as a speaker to UW is not discussing his ideas. It's adding someone to the community, knowing they've already hurt existing members of that community. It's giving someone a public platform to say things that he's already made clear in his manifesto. I truly don't understand how these questions were genuine attempts to discuss and understand his views and the validity of them as you claim they are. He continues in a discussion of how men and women are different. Frankly, I'm not interested in discussing this section, as this is more related to Claim A than Claim B, and as I mentioned, we're more focused on Claim B here, so I'm going to skip it for now. He discusses how a dangerous narrative has been taking hold in recent years, that the gender gap is mostly the fault of men and the patriarchal organizations they have built to serve their interests. I'm not quite sure why this narrative is dangerous. I'm attempting to show that discrimination against women in computer science is systemic, and who else would have created this system that harms women other than men? I'm sure there weren't enough non-binary people in power to put this system in place. Actually, that's not true. I know why it's dangerous, but that's because I've read the whole article, so we'll get back to it later. Don't worry about it. The women I talk to who are working in Silicon Valley are enjoying their experiences as software engineers. Clearly, there are bad actors in companies where the culture is broken, but the vast majority of women work at companies that make significant efforts to provide a supportive work experience. Second-hand individual stories are quite possibly the worst way to demonstrate a point, especially when many of the statistics I've shown up to this point illustrate a much different narrative of the overall experience of women. Also, making a grand sweeping statement about how companies make significant efforts to provide a supportive work environment despite bad actors misses the mark. Not only is it not supported by anything other than a nice sentiment, but women shouldn't need to be making significant efforts to make a more supportive work experience within their places of work. Even in making this statement, you seem to understand that they are not inherently receiving the work experience they should get without the need for additional effort on their part or the company's part. Young men were arriving who had used personal computers young women lacked because families disproportionately bought computers for boys. NPR claims that, quote, as personal computers became more common, computer science professors increasingly assumed that their students had grown up playing with computers at home, end quote, and includes an anecdote from a woman who had a bad experience in her introductory programming class. I don't doubt that this woman had a bad experience, but the claim that computer science faculty were gearing their courses towards men with prior experience is simply not true. You were so close, so close. You did identify a potential systemic issue here, that young men are more likely to receive personal computers than young women. This is one of the many issues that can and does contribute to women systemically receiving less exposure to computer science, and thus becoming less likely to explore and even pursue a career in it. You seem to pull the wrong connotation from the claim provided, though. The problem is not that professors are maliciously and intentionally designing courses preferring men with prior experience. It's that systemic social and economic inequalities have contributed to biases that often make their way into course content. Stuart shows this chart and uses it as evidence that women simply chose to pursue other interests, which is a fairly lackluster interpretation of this graph. Just because the percentage of women in computer science is decreasing doesn't automatically mean it's because they chose to pursue other interests. We can see that all fields have the ability to rise and not take away from the others, seeing as from 1965 to 1985, they were all increasing with relatively the same slope. This is not a measure of the percentage of women in each major relative to the total number of women in the university. It's simply a measurement of the percentage of women in each major relative to each major's individual population, so they don't rely on each other. So then why could this be? Why after 1985 could the ratio of women to men increasingly favor the men only in computer science but not in any other STEM major? I have a couple theories. Theory number one, as video games became increasingly available in the 80s and 90s, one of the main motivations for prospective computer science students became to make video games, and this industry has been one that predominantly targets men. Theory number two, while science courses such as anatomy, biology, physics, and chemistry are required by the vast majority of secondary schools to graduate, when computer science even exists as an option for students to take, it is made an optional class, meaning other science courses get much more foot traffic and women are given much more exposure to general science courses than computer science courses before college. And theory number three, as discussed in earlier statistics and reports, society has predominantly enabled and encouraged men to work with computers instead of women, leading to a lack of support which is greatly needed to encourage anyone into any potential new field, let alone computer science. Now, these theories don't even scratch the surface of issues that have resulted in less women pursuing a career in computer science. To disregard these conversations by saying women simply chose to pursue other interests does an injustice to the ongoing discussion of diversity and inclusion, as well as the systematic problems that have barred women from the computer science industry to this day. On top of all that, I said I would mostly avoid his arguments based on biological differences between the sexes, but I think it's important to point out that this chart diminishes the strength of that argument pretty significantly. Women are clearly continuing to grow in numbers in the scientific community here, which makes it odd to attribute the lack of women in computer science to biological differences as a primary factor. The more I study the gender gap in computer science, the more I become convinced that there are no simple answers. When I hear a claim or encounter a graph, I find that it takes a great deal of effort to drill down into the details, and I almost always end up concluding, quote, it's complicated, end quote. As mentioned before, when facing systemic issues relating to the gender gap in computer science, which I'm assuming is what you're referring to here, the solution isn't to shrug, say it's complicated, then post an article about how we've hit our diversity peak. Maybe instead of saying it's complicated, we could take a deeper dive into why it's complicated or understanding these complications. He goes on to use another graph to demonstrate women being less interested in computer science. I feel I'd iterate a lot of the similar points. For example, there are two primary booms shown in the graph relating to computer science, bachelor's degrees obtained, and women were much more receptive to the first boom from 1975 to 1985, a roughly 3% increase in bachelor's degrees earned, than the second boom in the early 2000s, when the theories I described earlier had fully taken root, a roughly 1% increase in bachelor's degrees earned. Stuart moves on to discuss free choice in relation to choosing STEM versus non-STEM careers, attempting to lump computer science in with the rest of the sciences. In this section, he works with the assumption that everyone is able to freely choose which field they'd like to explore. Free choice is fine, but free educated choice is really where the money's at, and it's really what truly matters here, where people have the ability to choose their field having sufficiently explored and understood all their potential options. As discussed earlier, computer science is much less available to explore before college compared to the other sciences. So I think it's not fair to add computer science into the discussion of free choice in relation to the other sciences. Not to mention that with the increasing amounts of student loans and pricing of universities, it's difficult to explore a lot of potential courses in areas of interest in college without paying more money. Going to college to find out what you want to do is becoming less and less of a realistic option. So while there be more free choice associated with the rest of the sciences, there is not enough consistent quality access to computer science education before college to deem that there is a free educated choice for everyone, let alone just women. In his conclusion, he discusses how many top CS programs such as UW, Stanford, Princeton, CMU, and Harvey Mudd through diversity efforts have raised their percentages to anywhere between 30 to over 50% women, and then stagnated, while the nationwide average has gone from 17.6% to 18.7%. He continues by saying, computer science departments have never put more attention and resources into the diversity campaign than they have in the last few years. Quite the claim to make nationwide. Could it be possible that maybe departments with lower percentages of women haven't put more attention and resources into the diversity campaign compared to top universities? Now, I don't have the evidence for this claim, but neither do you. So it seems our claims are equally valid. Not to mention that women exploring CS is dictated by much more than just their college experience, as we've discussed. I worry that lack of progress will make us more likely to switch from positive messages about women succeeding in tech to negative stories about men behaving badly in tech, which I think will do more harm than good. Women will find themselves wondering if they should resent men, and men will feel guilty for sins committed by other men. Women are not going to find this message appealing, and men will find themselves feeling even more awkward around women than they otherwise would be. Women are perfectly capable of separating individual and company-wide instances of discrimination or harassment on the part of men from the totality of men. Men, such as myself, are perfectly capable of understanding the pain that is caused by men in the computer science industry while not feeling personally guilty or attacked for those actions. The only reason a man should feel guilty for sins committed by other men is if they've committed those sins themselves. Additionally, advertising the wrongs done by men in tech, even as a man myself, can demonstrate progress being made to eliminate discrimination and harassment in the workplace. I'm not exactly sure why that would be unappealing. It's time for everyone to be honest, and my honest view is that having 20% of women in tech is probably the best we are likely to achieve. My honest view is that this take sucks and is historically inaccurate, as demonstrated earlier by the fact that we have achieved 37% of computer scientists being women in the past. Obviously, many people will disagree with my assessment. I have already been told that expressing such ideas is hurtful to women, but it is exactly because I care so much about diversity that I value honesty above politeness. There's a difference between being honest about diversity and just plain giving up on diversity. Saying 20% is good enough is giving up. Boiling ideas about the gender gap down to it's complicated is giving up. Giving up is not an option when it comes to issues of diversity. Because these issues are systemic, it will take constant effort to combat discrimination. And as a self-proclaimed champion of diversity, I would hope you would understand that much. In the last 10 months, I have taken the time to talk to those who disagree with me. I welcome such conversations, I have strong opinions, but I also realize that I could be wrong. As much as I hope this is true, and may have even been at the time, after the amount of conversations you've had in the last 4-ish years since the conceptualization and publication of this article, you seemingly haven't changed your stance at all. And I don't think you realize that you could be wrong, truly. I hope I'm wrong by saying that, but I don't think I am. certainly hope it isn't, because I'm about to discuss it. Just to be clear, this is the name of the article. This is not like a question I'm positing, just so we got that out of the way. Personally, this is the most painful and frustrating read for me. His mask definitely comes off a bit, and previous statements about being open to discussion are undercut by sweeping statements such as, "We have failed to properly educate those graduate students. We left them with the impression that they were right to see themselves as victims and to encourage them to continue to try to silence ideas that leave them with hurt feelings." Where Stuart, despite supposedly being open to conversation, views pushback against his article as silencing and hurt feelings, with quotes like, "They represent an ongoing attempt to pressure me into silence." But we'll get to why this is quite possibly the weakest claim he's made among his plethora of weak claims. Now, this article was primarily written as a response to the backlash from its previous article. He opens with a tweet from Jordan Peterson. I'd like to take this time to mention that the aforementioned Peterson actually shared Stuart's previous article, Why Women Don't Code, greatly increasing Stuart's views and platforms. But sure, he's being silenced. My article initially generated a great deal of interest. Many news organizations wrote about it, including Inside Higher Ed, the Seattle Times, The Stranger, GeekWire, and Campus Reform. I was invited to do 2 podcasts and a segment on our local news. Yeah, he's definitely being silenced. I get like 2 podcast invites a week. They will characterize any discussion of sex differences, no matter how calm and rational, as a form of gender harassment, which in turn constitutes sexual harassment. In other words, if you dare to discuss the science of sex differences even at a university, there's a good chance that you'll be accused of violating US law. Hey, I'm in different clothes now. It's another day and my camera died. For someone who likes to push back against blanket statements about how all conservatives are racist, he sure likes throwing around blanket statements at his naysayers. Having just finished dissecting your article about women in clothing, there's a lot more going on here than just discussion of sex differences. In fact, as I mentioned in the beginning of that article's dissection, I avoided most of that conversation. To boil down criticisms against you as being accused of violating US law because you discuss differences between men and women is incredibly disingenuous, and again, not the reaction of someone who's seemingly open to conversation. A group of grad students provided a detailed rebuttal to Stuart's argument, as well as a statement to the University of Washington listing concrete actions to improve diversity efforts at the university, detailing his argument as a symptom of gender harassment as a part of the culture there. Instead of talking about the detailed rebuttal, Stuart puts his sole focus on a single word: harassment, as you can see in the title of the article. Instead of having an open and honest discussion, as he repeatedly vocalized that he wants, he avoids it at all costs in an attempt to gain sympathy from his supporters by talking about how he's been accused of sexual harassment. As the university announced that they would act on some of the grievances filed with the union, and those grievances were implemented into university policy, Stuart mindfully reflects on the backlash to his article. As this process has unfolded, I have come to realize that the mere mention of James Damore awakens a tribal response from supporters of the equity agenda. Saying anything positive about Damore is considered a form of harassment. Let alone the gross use of the word tribal as a synonym for violent, I'm going to assume. Again, Stuart is unwilling to say anything actually in response to the grad student's actual rebuttal, and instead focusing on that one word, harassment. He wasn't just saying positive things about Damore, he was again advocating for the university to give him a platform as a bridge to giving up on diversity efforts related to the inclusion of women. But sure, go off. He goes on to describe the specific grievance demands that were accepted. I will only be mentioning one of these 3 demands, as it's the only one Stuart sees importance in discussing as well. A group of mostly senior faculty will review the introductory programming courses to, quote, ensure that they are inclusive of students from all backgrounds. His response: the 3rd concession hits closest to home, because I designed the introductory programming courses, and my primary work responsibility is teaching and managing the courses. Why my courses should be investigated is not entirely clear, but I have heard it suggested that students might be reluctant to take a course from me because of my Coolette article. In all fairness, it is kind of hard to imagine how a computer science program designed in 2004 could be improved. Since the report is completed as of Stuart's next article, where he discusses some of the contents, I'll hold off discussion until we get there. Consider it foreshadowing for 10-ish minutes from now. He links to his emails that he sent to mailing lists before the publication of his Why Women Don't Code article, and they're not incredibly interesting, although again not initially what you would assume from his description of them. He says, quote, my intent was to sincerely discuss this issue with others in the school. which is whatever, but doesn't really line up with the content of the emails when you look at them. The emails range from expressing disagreement with various workshops going on around the school to just providing resources for people to look at that support his point of view. Neither of these actions really have an air of open discussion about them, and more so act as outlets for him to express and defend his opinions. He never asks any questions in relation to having an open discussion, or trying to understand where the university and other faculty are coming from, which is more of a one-way street than an open discussion. The closest he gets is asking how the university could make someone like James Damore feel welcome and comfortable in the community, and we've already broken that one down. He then shifts the discussion towards the, quote, great deal of ambiguity about what constitutes sexual harassment, and how ultimately courts will decide what falls under the definition of, quote, verbal and nonverbal behaviors that convey hostility, objectification, exclusion, or second-class status about members of one gender. To which I would reply, it's perfectly okay to have questions about harassment to address concerns you may have. But at the end of the day, unless you committed some form of harassment, why are you worried about it? Your article was considered harassment not because you pulled statistics comparing men and women, but because of the misleading and false implications and conclusions you drew from those statistics. Again, there's a lot more nuance than the narrative he's trying to create here, and it's a very disingenuous way, as I mentioned, to have this conversation. He continues the sentiment through the rest of the article with statements like, although discussion of sex differences is considered sexual harassment, it does not necessarily constitute illegal sexual harassment, and individuals who cross the line by discussing sex differences will be warned not to repeat the behavior and will probably be okay as long as they comply. And finally, we come full circle. We finally get to revisit the beginning of this segment where he claimed he was being silenced. Let me read two of the last three paragraphs in full, because I don't think dissecting snippets really gets the whole picture here and does them justice. Count me among the stubborn, and you will understand why the settlement of the grievance put forward by our graduate students is disappointing to me. I'm unhappy that my courses are being investigated, but in some way the new forms of monitoring and the new training workshops are more disturbing because they represent an ongoing attempt to pressure me into silence. I am also disappointed with the University of Washington for settling the case without resolving the central question of whether my discussion of these issues constituted gender harassment. It leaves me and others like me with no clarity about where our free speech rights end and where illegal sexual harassment begins. And even more disappointing, it means that we have failed to properly educate those grad students. We could have rejected their claim of harassment and championed the idea that universities need to preserve the tradition of open discussion of all ideas, encouraging them to become the kind of anti-fragile scientists and engineers our society needs. Instead, we left them with the impression that they were right to see themselves as victims and to encourage them to continue to try to silence ideas that leave them with hurt feelings. Okay. Number one, can't emphasize this enough. He's literally the most vocal professor. He was invited to multiple pieces of media to discuss his opinions. He's not being silenced in any way. He's getting pushback. Number two, insinuating his opinions are the correct ones by disparaging the grad students who pushed against him is among one of the grosser moments in these articles. As someone who's such a staunch advocate of free speech, saying they're not properly educated because they don't agree with him is incredibly shitty. Number three, for the millionth time, he claims he's trying to preserve a tradition of open discussion, but his actions prove anything but. Number four, he posits that society needs, quote, anti-fragile scientists and engineers. Now, I actually agree with him here. His fragility needs some work when he gets pushed back. I'm sick of this one. Let's move on. It's kind of an interesting trend how the titles of these get more and more unhinged as the articles do. To set the stage, in his last article, he complained about a senior group of faculty conducting a review on the introductory course materials for the program he built in 2004 and has remained relatively the same since its inception. This post discusses the results of that report as well as his opinions on society as a result. Now, as I mentioned, I've been a student and a TA for these courses, and I think they're good on both ends. In the same regard, I think Stuart is a great teacher. He's great at teaching the material, as I've mentioned before. But just because something is good or great doesn't mean they can't be improved. My main problems are not with the course itself, but with the rigidity to change and experimentation on the part of Stuart. This rigidity has alienated students in minority groups and women, and it's not enough to be great, let alone good at teaching the material. He begins this one with another mention of Jordan Peterson. Brief side note, with two opening mentions of this individual, I feel I should give a little background on who he is. Peterson is a Canadian professor of psychology who has developed into a very popular conservative talking head in the US. Stuart, to my understanding, is a very big fan of Peterson. I, myself, am not. There's a lot of videos and articles both supporting and renouncing Peterson. I think the best all-around video of critiquing Peterson is done by Natalie Wynn, aka ContraPoints, that I will leave in the description. She provides some great insight on Peterson and in turn Stuart to some degree, including some commentary on the difference between using sex-based biological differences and forming implications and arguments on them, a topic which I mostly avoided, but is an important critique of why women don't code. When Peterson shared the Why Women Don't Code article, he made an implication that Stuart's position at the school might be in jeopardy. He used this as a springboard to announce that I was stripped of my primary teaching duties and given a highly unusual one-year probationary appointment. The administration insists this decision has nothing to do with the controversy generated by my article, but as I will explain, that seems highly unlikely. Now, I know jack shit about how tenure works, and I have no insight about what happened behind the scenes here, absolutely zero. So what I'm about to say is completely my opinion and comes from no insider info whatsoever. That should cover my ass. I agree with Stuart here. I think the article is one of the two primary reasons this one-year appointment was given. I think the other, as mentioned, is that he's been more rigid to change than recent hires the department has made, but we'll get into that later. That being said, it's 2022, and with the benefit of hindsight, given that this article was written at the beginning of 2020, he's still working at the university, so take that as you will. He goes on to list a set of recommendations given to him as a result of the review done on the intro courses. He prefaces these by describing how highly rated the intro courses are and how many students have gone through the program in the last 15 years, in which it has remained relatively the same. A working group was formed and it produced a set of recommendations. These included a relaxation of grading on coding style, allowing students to work together in a group for part of their grade instead of requiring them to complete all graded work individually, training for TAs and inclusion and implicit bias, review all course materials for inclusiveness. For instance, of a lecture that involves calculating body mass index, BMI, using guidelines from the National Institutes of Health, the report noted that it, quote, seems insensitive to present students with a program that would print out that some of them are obese while others are normal, end quote. And finally, a reduction in the amount of effort expended pursuing cheating cases by 50%, even though there has been no reduction in cheating cases. The report also recommends that courses incorporate inclusiveness best practices as outlined in an Allen School document. These include the addition of Indigenous land acknowledgement to the syllabus, the use of gender-neutral names such as Alex and June instead of Alice and Bob, the use of names that reflect a variety of cultural backgrounds, Shin, Sergei, Navina, Tuan, Esteban, Sasha, and avoidance of references that depend on cultural knowledge of sports, pop culture, theater, literature, or games, the replacement of phrases like you guys with folks or y'all, and a declaration of instructors' pronouns and a request for students' pronoun preferences. Let's break this list down, trying to be as generous as I possibly can. Relaxation of grading style. Doesn't affect course content. Allowing group work for students to work together for part of their grade doesn't directly affect course content, but could depending on how it's incorporated. Training for TAs and inclusion and implicit bias doesn't affect course content. Review of all course materials for inclusiveness can affect course content, but not very meaningfully. At worst, an example such as the BMI one provided by the university can be replaced with another example such as GPA, a program to provide descriptions for each GPA, or restaurant tips, less than 15% being a bad tip, 15 to 20% being an okay tip, etc. Very basic potential changes to course content here. And lastly, a reduction in pursuing cheating cases doesn't affect course content. And the inclusive practices are trivially affecting course content. Given this information, these requests shouldn't really affect the stature or high ratings of the intro CS courses, given how little they're actually affecting course content. Let's see how Stuart responds to them. Most of these suggestions seem to rely on the notion that undergraduates are delicate. While I agree that we must be careful to ensure that all students feel welcome and respected, we should be helping our students to become anti-fragile. So I will continue to use the BMI example, I will maintain high standards for grading, and I will continue to pursue cheating cases vigorously. I will continue to say you guys and to make occasional cultural references. In the case of pronouns, I have always made an effort to accommodate requests from transgender students, but I refuse to use words that are not part of the English language. It is the prerogative of the faculty to change the intro courses if they so choose. I understand that inclusive teaching is popular now, so it makes sense that others would want to move them in that direction. Even though this review was precipitated by my Quillette article, it is not in itself evidence that I am being treated differently on account of my political beliefs. I would truly love his definitions of the word delicate and anti-fragile in this context, because as we outlined before, these changes do little to nothing to affect course content, and they do the bare minimum to help students from a variety of backgrounds see themselves as programmers. If someone named, I don't know, Alex, for example, is the person being used in all the homework problems, I'm sure Alex would feel really good about themselves and be able to put themselves in the shoes of the fictional Alex trying to solve the coding problem. Someone named Shin or Esteban would probably be able to do these problems too, but don't we want to allow them to see themselves in these problems as well and give them the same experience that Alex would have? It's a very small thing, but as we discussed with women in CS, discrimination doesn't take place nearly as loudly or outwardly as it once did. It's like having a bunch of speed bumps on a freeway. Sure, you can probably get to where you want to go, but why the hell are there speed bumps on a freeway? Incorporating diversity and inclusion initiatives isn't to pander to delicate students, it's to try to remove those speed bumps. It's incredibly petty and, dare I say, fragile to fight back against these inclusion initiatives. Taking an action like continuing to say "you guys" is a speed bump. Keeping the BMI problem is another speed bump. Every word in the English language is made up. Drawing a bar for what words you will or won't use is petty and idiotic. Not only that, but they are part of the English language. Definitions of neopronouns like Z, which I'm assuming is what you're referring to here, can be found on radical websites like dictionary.com. Ooh. It won't be long now till even more are added, so get ready to learn some new English words. Lastly, even though I acknowledge that he was likely right that one of the reasons he was given the one-year appointment was because of his previous articles, that doesn't mean he's being discriminated against on the basis of his political views. It's because his articles caused real harm to diversity and inclusion movements, and in turn caused harm to specific groups of students, which shouldn't be acceptable, but he still works at the university, so what do I know? And again, he later discusses how the administration claims that my one-year appointment is part of a more general change in the management of the intro courses, but that doesn't make sense. But it kind of does. Your theory and the one provided by the university are not mutually exclusive. They can be both true, as I am positing. You have proven that you're resistant to changes that minimally affect course content. What about changes that involve the experimentation of the format of these courses? Now that one of the two intro courses, CSE 142, or CS1 as he sometimes refers to it, is no longer required for the major. That may be good ground to start experimenting to try to draw a variety of students and focus more on learning and growth than grades and coding style. That's something you've demonstrated you want no part in. So while I don't believe a general change in the management of the intro courses is the sole reason for this reappointment, I do believe it is a primary factor. Next, there's a short section on heterodox teaching, which I have no knowledge of. After a little typity typing, I found the website for the academy he mentions, the Heterodox Academy. Their mission statement is as follows. Heterodox Academy is a nonpartisan collaborative of 5,000 plus professors, educators, administrators, staff, and students who are committed to enhancing the quality of research and education by promoting open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement in institutions of higher learning. I'm sure at this point, we already know what two words caught my eye: constructive disagreement. I think Stuart's got the disagreement part down, but the constructive part is I think what I'm taking more issue with here. He goes on with a discussion of his attendance at an Affirmation Action bake sale, which I'll save discussion for until his next post, which is more related to the content of that discussion. What I do want to mention from this section is at the end of it, Stuart mentions an event that occurred at this sale. After the sale, the director of the Allen School messaged Stuart condemning Stuart's, quote, lack of sensitivity to minority students and continued and almost gleeful denial of their experiences. I mention this because the director actually sent this message in a response to a misreported quote. The misreported quote was Stuart saying, quote, I don't see racism on campus, end quote, when he actually said, quote, I don't see rampant racism on campus, end quote. I have two thoughts on this event. One, I know it's a common and often misused sentiment, but just a friendly, gentle reminder to confirm your sources and information. There's much safer ways of getting information about Stuart to critique him, like these articles. Whether the director's criticisms still hold weight in this case is up for debate. I personally think the correction makes the sentiment worse, which leads me to my second point. The misreported quote, I don't see racism on campus, implies a lack of awareness or understanding of minority students, versus the actual quote, I don't see rampant racism on campus, implies an awareness and acceptance of racism on campus, which can in turn also imply complicity in regards to racism on campus. So the correction isn't redeeming. I don't want to delve too deep here. In a couple minutes, we'll hear plenty of his opinions on anti-racism, but I felt this was an important enough point to address. To round out the article, Stuart describes some of his life experiences. I'm going to read the next few paragraphs in full for that very reason. Content warning for self-harm and homophobia. I spent New Year's Eve of my senior high school in a hospital because I almost succeeded in taking my own life with a bottle of rat poison. I was a young gay person who couldn't face telling people I was a member of that hated group known as homosexuals. Although it was a dark period, that experience provided me with a source of strength later in life. If I was so unacceptable that I thought it was better to be dead than alive, then what was to be lost by telling people what I really think? By the time I got to Stanford as a graduate student in 1979, I was openly gay. Not many people were at the time. When I started teaching at the university, I found that many gay people wanted to talk to me, but almost always in private. They would tell me that they couldn't afford to be as open as I was. But even I felt the pressure to conform. In 1982, I applied for my dream job. The Stanford Computer Science Department was hiring someone to manage the intro courses. I was doing the job on a temporary basis, but they were looking to appoint a permanent staff member. Unfortunately, their search concluded just after the Stanford Daily published a full-page article I had written entitled, quote, "On Being Gay, Feelings and Perceptions," end quote. The chair of the department told me that they wanted to offer me the job, but that they had been embarrassed by my article. They wanted me to promise never to publish such an article again. I had an opportunity to be brave and refuse his request, but I didn't. I said that I couldn't make that promise, but that I didn't feel the need to publish any more articles anytime soon. That was enough to get me hired. And I didn't write any articles for the next 3 years until we got a new chair who told me I could publish whatever I wanted. Over the course of my life, it has been astonishing to watch anti-gay sentiment reverse. Today, the people on campus who need to worry about expressing their ideas are conservatives and religious people. Now it is the gays doing the punishing of anyone who opposes gay marriage, gay adoption, hate speech codes, and civil rights protections for gays. Everything old is new again. I'm once again having private conversations behind closed doors in my office with closeted individuals, but this time they are students, faculty, staff, and alumni who oppose the equity agenda. They are deeply concerned about the university's direction, but they are also afraid of jeopardizing their current or future job prospects. They also worry about losing friendships and professional relationships. One faculty colleague described it as, quote, "mob rule." As a result, I can't bring myself to look down on the closeted individuals who offer me support behind closed doors. The threat is real just as it was when I compromised my principles to get a job nearly 40 years ago. I'm concerned that people believe free speech is improving on college campuses, when in fact things are getting worse. We have fewer overt examples of speakers being shouted down and disinvited, but now the censorship is going underground. Those who talk to me behind closed doors censor themselves because they know the consequences of speaking up. As the economist Timur Kuran has explained, this preference falsification is extremely dangerous because it prevents us from having the meaningful conversations necessary to find practical solutions to problems. Now, a lot to unpack there. First off, I empathize with your experiences as a young gay man, and I appreciate you sharing them here. I will never be able to understand the hardships and struggles you faced balancing trying to live as you are while working on your professional advancement. I read your original article published in the Stanford Daily and found it incredibly insightful, endearing, and refreshingly honest, especially considering the time in which you published it. That is as much as I understand about 1982, considering I wasn't born until 17 years later. Stanford's computer science department being ashamed of your article about your experience as a gay man is, as you pointed out, a form of silencing. Being gay is, as you noted in the Stanford Daily, part of you. You know what it means to be gay because you've experienced it and you understand it. It doesn't preoccupy your thoughts now. It is as natural and as forgettable to you as breathing is. Being gay is part of who you are, no matter where you go, who you meet, or what you do. Holding political beliefs is not the same in this regard. Although I didn't consider myself it at the time, instead clinging to the title of centrist, I was functionally conservative in high school. I was anti-abortion, for example. Now, the most conservative I'd consider myself is democratic socialist. Political beliefs should be adaptable to new information. Opposing gay rights is denying people as they are and as they always will be. Opposing conservative values is not. Even more than that, conservatives have not and never have been silenced. Hell, at the time of you publishing this article, Trump was president. Conservatism is, by definition, an ideology about maintaining the status quo and not breaking from tradition. Throughout the history of our country and even the world, progressives have fought conservatives tooth and nail to make, as they are aptly named, progress. Conservative media is everywhere, such as Fox News, shows such as Ben Shapiro's, and your own articles. Conservatives are not being closeted, as you would say. Free speech is not getting worse. Instead, conservatives have simply gotten more pushback than ever before in our world. The dominance of social media and information sharing like never before has contributed to this. Free speech is better than it's ever been. Free speech, however, does not mean that you're exempt from the consequences of your speech. As I hope has been evident through this video, I've tried my best to confront your arguments in good faith despite the occasional jab, and explain why I believe they are not only incorrect but actively harmful. This comparison is false. Let's move on to antiracism. fuck is this? You are so lucky, or maybe unlucky, depending on how good this video is, I guess, that I didn't run out of letters. I might have just cried and stopped on the spot. Now, this article that we're about to talk about was written as a response to BLM protests that were spurred from the murder of George Floyd. Stuart begins by describing actions taken by protesters against the school administration, including disparaging the university president for her lack of action in relation to several demands petitioned by students. In response to these protests, diversity officers at the university sent an email describing their commitment to anti-racism. Stuart, unsure whether this is pandering to protesters or a, quote, serious institutional commitment, end quote, by the university, sees fit to educate himself on the topic of anti-racism. Most of the rest of this article revolves around criticisms of Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be a Racist. Arguably the most popular book about anti-racism. Did I say How to Be a Racist? God damn it, dude. Most of the rest of this article revolves around Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, arguably the most popular book about anti-racism, especially at the height of the aforementioned protests. He begins by declaring most Americans, including himself and Kendi, as those who wish to eliminate racial inequity, and acknowledging that racial inequities do still exist. Like most Americans, including me, Kendi wants to eliminate racial inequity. He writes that, quote, racial inequity is when two or more racial groups are not standing on approximately equal footing. By way of example, the author notes that, quote, 71% of white families live in owner-occupied homes in 2014, compared to 45% of Latinx families and 41% of black families. Even conservatives would concede that these figures represent unequal outcomes. So it seems like you might be engaging with some material here, actually. Maybe we'll get some good analysis of Kendi's book. Maybe have some concessions, some legitimate refutations of his work. You know, maybe I was wrong. Maybe his arguments aren't mostly reactionary. Maybe we can have a good, productive conversation. Oh no, I just read the next paragraph. By Kendi's analysis, in fact, I am an unrepentant racist who has perpetuated racial inequity in every policy decision I have made in my career. So is everyone I know. I was hoping to find some middle ground where Kendi and I might meet, but I couldn't. Now's as good a time as any to talk about a concept known as white guilt. According to Wikipedia, white guilt refers to a belief that white people bear a collective responsibility for the harm which has resulted from historical or current racist treatment of people belonging to other racial groups, as for example in the context of the Atlantic slave trade, European colonialism, and the genocide of indigenous peoples. I personally believe that white guilt takes two primary forms, one in liberals and one in conservatives. For the liberals, it takes the form of white shame. White shame differs from white guilt. When people feel guilt, it is related to thoughts of feeling bad about some action. Shame, on the other hand, is a more unpleasant and painful emotion targeting the entire self and lacking any adaptive properties. Guilt says, I feel bad about what I did, and shame says, I am bad. Because shame attacks the self, it becomes very difficult to use that shame to foster the kind of attitude and behavioral changes needed to address racism. In fact, using shame in this way can cause the opposite effect. Shame is a natural and expected circumstance for some people. In particular, in our society, it is something that is encouraged a lot more than it should be. In fact, people may be made to feel shame for things that they had no role in creating, according to verywellmind.com. White shame essentially involves a white person putting much more focus and attention on what they did wrong, other than how they can improve themselves and make sure the same mistake isn't made again. Most commonly, this type of shame arises when an instance of racism happens on an individual-to-individual scale as a reaction to that instance of racism being called out. I've certainly been guilty of this myself in the past. The opposite can be said of conservatives. In response to being called out for racism, neither what they did wrong nor how they can improve are confronted. Instead, a feeling of defensiveness arises. Denial and arguing usually occur as a result. Now, these aren't two all-encompassing cases, and I'm certainly not close to an expert on this. Conservatives can experience white guilt, liberals can be defensive and argumentative. In this case, however, I think it's safe to say that the analysis might be spot on. Instead of engaging with the idea that the institutions and systems everyone has been a part of throughout their life have in some way contributed to racial inequity, Stuart becomes defensive and closed off to the potential discourse here. Stuart then shifts his focus to computing, and much like the Why Women Don't Code article, begins to discuss the lack of black people in computer science. He mentions a report from the Computer Research Association that says, blacks receiving computer science PhDs, working in technical roles at prominent companies, and teaching computer science at universities represent less than 2% of personnel in these areas. The data show that the pipeline that produces professional computer scientists is producing very few black computer scientists. Because he is, quote, most familiar with the portion of this pipeline that involves introductory computer science courses, end quote, Stuart's discourse revolves mostly around intro college courses and pre-college examinations, such as the AP Computer Science A exam. His first chart displays scores by year separated by self-reported identities. In this chart, we can see scores from the aforementioned AP Computer Science A exam from 1997 to 2019, where scores in all groups have improved at about the same rate, but Black students are consistently about a grade lower than white and Asian students. Stuart's response is as follows. During the 23-year period covered by the available data, Black students have scored on average about a point below whites and Asians. Scores have been going up over time for all groups, but the gap has persisted. In 1997, the gap between Black students and the white Asian average was 1.09. It has since grown to 1.26 as of 2019. All of this is publicly available information. By Kendi's definition, APCS-A is a racist test because it produces unequal outcomes. That makes me a racist because I regularly participate in the annual exam grading. In fact, I was the chief reader when the APCS-A exam was introduced, which means that I decided how it should be graded and how raw scores should be converted into AP scores. Again, instead of engaging with Kendi's argument here, Stuart resorts to being defensive. Instead of examining the possibility that the AP test is racist, he postures that he'd be a racist if this were true, and he's one of the main individuals in charge of grading the AP tests. Since Stuart wasn't willing to engage here, let's do it together. According to the National Education Association, in their article about the racist beginnings of standardized testing, they discuss how bias still exists, despite the fact that many obvious and clear biases have been screened and removed from testing. And although most test makers screen test items for obvious bias, their efforts often do not detect underlying bias in the test's form or content. These biases have long-ranging and damaging consequences, not only for students, but for their families and also the economic well-being of their communities. There's a clear correlation, for example, between test scores and property values. Popular private school rating systems, such as GreatSchools.org, may be accelerating existing patterns of racial and socioeconomic segregation. The rankings are based largely on standardized test scores and are fed into national real estate websites. According to a 2019 study of grade school ratings, areas with highly rated schools usually see increases in home prices. And as we mentioned earlier, Black and Hispanic families are disproportionately poor in this country compared to other groups of people, and would be less likely to obtain property for their kids to go to these schools as a result. And just like when we talked about systemic discrimination against women, there are many reasons and factors contributing to these biases. The correlation between property values and test scores only scratches the surface here. Stuart posits that maybe the problem is with the AP course itself and not the exam. Complaints he specifically mentions of the course are too narrow of a focus on computer programming, which will fail to motivate underrepresented students, lack of group work, which fails to reflect the field as a whole, and lack of history and social implications of programming. A group of educators, in response to these criticisms, created the AP Computer Science Principles course, focusing on societal impact of programming and creativity with more group work. As Stuart points out, more Black students took the AP Computer Science Principles exam, but the data looks the same. Side note, creating a whole new course to address these criticisms is not a great solution. If you are trying to incorporate material that would benefit underrepresented students, like Black students, it should be included in the original APCS course, and course content should shift accordingly. It does nothing to address the criticisms of the original APCS course, because they're forcing students to take time out of their schedule for another course, actually creating another barrier for entry rather than an assist. Which is especially important here considering, as discussed earlier, computer science classes are optional, and there's not a lot of room in secondary students' schedules for optional courses. I know Stuart wasn't the one to develop these courses, I just wanted to make a general point about the poor implementation of this idea. He goes on to discuss his thoughts on these pieces of data. The best minds in our field, and the ones eager to remedy the type of inequities that Kendi identifies, have failed to produce a course and exam that can close the performance gap. So what should we do instead? Both APCS exams test mastery of programming skills and computer science concepts. Students who fail to master these concepts will have difficulty creating or analyzing computer software. What is the alternative? If you're willing to hold these two exams as these almighty tools to determine whether students are capable as programmers, you have to be able to answer one question. Now, before I ask this question, I don't want any, oh, I don't know bullshit. Because frankly, this is a serious topic, and what you're saying has very serious implications. What makes Black students inherently worse at programming? It's a point you dance around and completely avoid, even though by continuing to advocate for these systems and defend their existence, there should be some reason why you think Black students are worse programmers than white and Asian students from the argument you're making. Because that's what you're saying. If these tests are Harry Potter sorting hats of exams and are faultless, why are Black students worse at programming? In some circles, there is a taboo against describing this kind of data, even though, as noted above, it is public information. But how can you solve a problem like racial inequality without measuring its effects? Kendi himself would seem to agree with this principle, at least in its broad form, or he would not have cited home ownership data and similar statistics in his book. You can describe this kind of data because, yes, you're right, this data needs to be discussed to solve a problem like racial inequality. The problem is you're not actually trying to solve the problem of racial inequality here. You're pointing at this data and then saying, but these tests aren't racist because that would mean I'm racist. That's not trying to solve the problem, that's being defensive and playing into reactionary politics. In other words, perhaps black students are just as accomplished as their white and Asian counterparts, with the exam as misfiring as a measurement tool. In this case, the only real alternative would be to abandon testing altogether, and I worry that proponents of anti-racist policies will soon be urging administrators to take this step. Kendi might consider the elimination of tests, or at least this kind of test, as a win for black students, because they will no longer be collectively disadvantaged by what he sees as a racist exam, but in fact we would be harming individual students by denying them the opportunity to demonstrate their level of mastery. That includes the black students who receive high scores on these exams and who can go on to pursue educational and professional opportunities on that basis. Exams are not the only way to demonstrate mastery in a topic, as you would suggest, and in no way reflect the real world. My boss has never pulled me aside and asked me to recite the Declaration of Independence from memory or else I'll get fired. I'm allowed to Google stuff, I'm allowed to make mistakes, I'm allowed to be wrong on a day-to-day basis, as long as I show that I'm willing and able to learn from those mistakes and mishaps. As the National Education Association mentions in their article from earlier, there are more effective assessment systems to evaluate students. Moving forward, the focus should be on promoting authentic assessments that reflect a broad range of students' learning and skills, including creativity, leadership, critical thinking, and collaboration. You can have group exams, projects, take-home assessments where using course materials is acceptable. Hell, you can still run exams, but also provide options for a final project or an oral exam with a TA or yourself to work through problems if you're overly concerned about evaluating individuals specifically. Now, the response I would expect from Stuart for this proposition is one of two different things. One, these different assessment systems don't do enough to assess an individual's level of mastery, or two, that these assessment systems are more susceptible to cheating. To the first potential refutation, I'd say these exams, in my opinion, but maybe not yours, aren't doing the trick either. So you may as well start experimenting with different formats, especially because at UW specifically, the CS1, aka CSE 142 class, is no longer required for the major, providing fertile ground for experimentation. To the second potential refutation, it's unfair to the vast majority of students who don't cheat and need a better system to learn in to design a course around the vast minority of students who do cheat. Worst case scenario, if a student cheats and is not caught, one of two things will happen. Either they'll learn more from future classes, they'll become good programmers, and learn from their mistakes, or they will be behind the curve and fall behind in future classes or in the industry after they graduate. Your primary purpose shouldn't be to catch students who are cheating. It should be to educate these students from every background to the best of your ability and help them grow. Stuart goes on to describe how many of these schools are beginning to adopt lottery systems for admission rather than standardized testing, as a response to the arguments around how standardized testing has failed black students. The result will be that the competence sorting function that was once the domain of admissions officials will now be kicked down the road to professors, who in turn will be pressured to maintain a racially balanced grade curve. Inevitably, employment recruiters will have to take on the sorting role, perhaps by administering the same kind of basic tests that schools are now shunning. First off, maintaining a racially balanced grading curve is something that zero people are asking for. Unless you believe there's something inherent about a specific group of people that would make them worse at a given subject, there's no reason grades shouldn't be theoretically equivalent throughout all races and ethnicities. It would be incredibly harmful long term to think a course is providing an equal experience to all groups of people when the reality is it's just a racially based grading curve. Second, what do you mean employers will have to administer basic tests? Many companies hiring software engineers send out coding assessments, have multiple coding interviews to audition for the role. It's a completely different argument whether these are effective measures to determine whether someone will be a good software engineer, but these basic tests are already in place throughout the industry. I feel like I might be misunderstanding you here, but I truly don't know any other way to interpret this thought. He shifts to discussion of CS1 and CS2 courses at UW, aka CSE 142 and 143, and argues that when students watch lectures, they get better grades. Kendi insists that we look at outcomes, but his reliance on racism as the sole explanation for any disparities in those outcomes allow him to short-circuit the need for argument and proof. Most of us would agree that students who work harder generally get higher grades because the extra effort leads them to a greater mastery of the material. And if it could be shown that students from some groups were spending more time on average than students from other groups, that would provide an alternative explanation for average differences in group performances. But according to Kendi's logic, this is all semantics, since we would be required to assume that the differences in lecture watching rates are themselves an artifact of racism. The anti-racism argument, as I hope I've demonstrated so far, is more than just declaring something as racist and avoiding proving it, as Stuart seems to suggest here. But the keyword in this paragraph is if. If it could be shown. Because where's the theory even coming from? I'll entertain this weird hypothetical. So if you had the data saying black students on average watched less lectures than white or Asian students, wouldn't that be something you'd want to explore? Maybe it's racism, maybe it's the professor, maybe it's both, who knows? But unless, again, you have some argument about why black students in this case would watch less lectures than white or Asian students, then there's something deeper going on that would be worth exploring. Since, as you mentioned, you, like most Americans, want to eliminate racial inequity, I hope you'd want to explore it as well. Watch, I can do the same thing. Watch, I can do the same thing with my argument. Most of us would agree students who work harder get higher grades. And if it could be shown that students from all types of groups were spending roughly the same amount of time on average watching lectures and studying, that would provide another explanation for why systemic racism is the issue regarding differences in group performances. Easy. In reference to a UW Daily column arguing against the university's continued employment of Reges, he states, I gather that he thinks as a white man I will fail to attract non-white students, and he is concerned that I don't spend time discussing issues of identity related to computing. You aren't being attacked as a white man. Why do you think no other white male professors were named specifically in this article? Being less white and male doesn't necessarily mean firing white male professors. It means making efforts to hire more professors that aren't white or male. You're being named here because even though you don't think so, your opinions and arguments made so far are harmful to all students who aren't white or Asian and male. We can see the effect of having too few black teachers, for example, through Malcolm Cawthorn in Brookline. I'd highly recommend reading the article, which I'll include among the resources that I'll be listing, but Malcolm's story shows us that not enough black teachers at his high school hurts students, hurts teachers, hurts the curriculum. It also hurts Malcolm himself, needing to shoulder the burden of much of the curriculum revolving around race and racism. This isn't an attack on white men, this is a call for more teachers who aren't white men. Many of the critics who offer this kind of criticism seem far more interested in broad ideological claims, rather than the data that might serve to support or refute their arguments. Many of the critics who offer this kind of criticism are truly interested in ideological claims, but also in data that supports their argument. Both are true. Even Ben & Jerry's dropped some statistics on systemic racism in education. You can't find something you're not looking for, you know what I mean? Should university officials make choices for our students? Should we force more black students to take the course even though they don't want to? Or should we prevent non-blacks from taking the class in order to ensure a desired arithmetic balance? One paradox here is that the Black Student Union petition demands, among other things, an enhanced profile for African studies. If acted upon, this demand would likely serve to disproportionately draw more talented black students away from STEM and thereby exacerbate the problem we're supposed to be solving. An enhanced profile for African studies doesn't take black students away from STEM? This provides an education to every student, not just black students. The Black Student Union is advocating for an expansion of the program, not for more black students to take African studies. This isn't anywhere close to a paradox. This claim is ludicrous. Again, artificially balancing students' grades, or attendance in this case, is not a solution. It hides the problem. Or perhaps we should follow the suggestion from the above quoted UW Daily editorial and modify the course so as to include more issues related to identity, ideally in a way that over time would attract a more diverse mix of students. But if so, we would need to address the biggest discrepancy, which happens to involve white students. They made up about 34% of the most recent freshman class, but represented only about 21% of the students who enrolled in the CS1 course over the last year. Should we redesign the course to be more attractive to whites? What kind of content would that involve? It's odd that he would make this argument in the same article that he discussed how white students got higher scores on average than black students. Because students who pass the APCSA exam are able to skip the CS1 course he's describing, like I did, for example. Not to mention, as we discussed in the response to the Why Don't Women Code article, about half of all schools in the US have computer science programs, and even less have a designated computer science teacher. And the schools that have computer science programs generally have more funding because they live in richer neighborhoods, which are predominantly white, again, all of which we've covered earlier. So in short, it would be only natural in this existing system that we currently have for the less white students to be taking the CS1 course. To wrap up the article, Stuart pivots back to Kendi. In response to Kendi's bout with cancer used as an analogy for racism, Stuart offers his own analogy. But from what I have seen, racism is more like a chronic illness that never quite goes away, but which one can seek to manage, much like the illness I've had for over 30 years. Cancer patients typically are laser focused on their illness and are willing to undergo extreme treatment because the alternative is often death. Those who live with chronic illness, on the other hand, learn to focus on other aspects of life whenever possible. Kendi demands an end to racism in America, and he wants it now. He certainly deserves it, but the reality is that we can't give him that. No country can. And so talking about it in the language of life or death apocalypse isn't realistic or helpful. Stuart describes his view of racism as chronic illness, saying we should learn to live with it, then, quote, learn to focus on other aspects of life whenever possible, essentially meaning to ignore it. To engage with his interpretation of the state of racism, people with chronic illnesses deserve to live as normal of a life as they possibly can, and we should do everything in our power as a society to help them do so. He seems to use this as a reason for complacency. There's work to be done still, and ignoring it whenever possible doesn't help the issue. Other Black authors, including Thomas Sowell, Shelby Steele, Glenn Lowry, Wilfred Riley, John McWhorter, and Coleman Hughes, present a more traditional and hopeful narrative. They have not given up on Martin Luther King's pursuit of a colorblind meritocracy, one in which his children would be judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. They acknowledge that racism still exists in America, but they believe we have made significant progress and that it is no longer a dominant factor in determining outcomes. As I worked on this article, I found myself jotting down notes in double column form to understand some of the differences between these two grand narratives, Kendi's and King's. Someone might be able to find a dialectical synthesis of these two narratives, but it eludes me. As far as I can tell, there is no middle ground to be found. The new anti-racists see their mission as an existential struggle that requires revolutionary action and all-or-nothing moral judgments. Quote, we should eliminate the term not racist from the human vocabulary. We are either being racist or anti-racist. Is that clear for you? There is no such thing as not racist, end quote. Civil rights traditionalists, on the other hand, recognize that the fight against racism must be accompanied by strategies aimed at tackling other problems, including crime, failing schools, family issues, and negative community influences. In these explanations, Stuart attempts to pit Kendi's message against King's, describing them as having no middle ground. King was an advocate for a socialist reorganization of the economy. Kendi is not exclusively providing all-or-nothing moral judgments, but instead advocating for a shift in our society's view of what racism is. Kendi is also not saying this in bolting. He also understands that, as you said, the fight against racism must also involve tackling problems such as crime and failing schools. These are not opposing figures, and to try to place Kendi by himself and place MLK among the ranks of conservatives, such as Thomas Sowell, is ahistorical. On top of that, tackling other problems can be done at the same time as handling issues in education. They're not mutually exclusive. Work needs to be done everywhere. In his final sentence, he feigns interest in open discourse again. And I am willing to discuss race with anyone on campus who wants to, though I warn that as part of such a discussion, I will advance the proposition that maybe, just maybe, not everything around us has to do with the color of our skin. Again, as I've said before, I truly hope you would be open to a two-way discussion, but I've yet to see evidence that the potential conversation would be anything more than a one-way argument, where you're mostly unwilling to concede anything, and I've seen no evidence you'd be truly open to such a conversation. Before we begin this conversation, let's start with getting a basic understanding of what a land acknowledgement is and why they matter. Conveniently enough, Selena Mills, a Canadian Indigenous writer, answers these very questions, so let's hear it from her. What is a land acknowledgement? Land acknowledgements are an honest and historically accurate way to recognize the traditional First Nations, Métis and/or Inuit territories of a place. They can be represented verbally or visually. Think signage, short theater presentations, or simple spoken word greetings. According to Anishinaabe Kwa Wanda Nanibush, the first curator of Indigenous art at the Art Gallery of Ontario, land acknowledgements have one goal, regardless of format. They commemorate Indigenous people's principal kinship to the land and the fact that we have not and cannot be erased from her, our collective First Mother. Quote, they're a starting place to a change in how the land is seen and talked about. They help redefine how people place themselves in relation to First Peoples. She continues to describe why they're important, but also why they fall short in some areas. And of course, although she describes these issues in the context of Canada, these concepts apply very easily to the United States as well. Why are land acknowledgements necessary? Inspired by the 94 recommended calls to action contained in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, land acknowledgements are a necessary first step towards honoring the original occupants of a place. They also help Canadians recognize and respect Indigenous peoples' inherent kinship beliefs when it comes to the land, especially since those beliefs were restricted for so long. When we're being honest about why land acknowledgements are important, recognition of the attempted genocide of Indigenous peoples in Canada, which spans centuries, they might seem like an inadequate gesture. But the NCTR's recommendations help provide a solid framework for reconciliation for the injustices that have been carried out against Indigenous communities. Broken treaty relationships, residential schools, the 60s scoop, and continued attempts by governmental, federal, provincial, and territorial, and religious groups to control the Indigenous family unit, resources, and access to services. I think that understanding colonization isn't just a historical problem, it's also a key component in grappling with why land acknowledgements are important today. Generations of Canadians have been affected, not just the oppressed. Now, not all Indigenous people are a monolith. Just like any group of people, they have their own individual thoughts on the efficacy of land acknowledgements. It's also arguable whether UW's universal application of land acknowledgements meets the goals of having a land acknowledgement in the first place. This is another hotly debated topic, even in Selena Mill's own discourse. Is there a wrong way to do a land acknowledgement? Perhaps. I'm still on the fence. In my opinion, when they are dry, scripted, and obviously hold no meaning to the speaker, I am critical, but I also appreciate that at least they're being done in more and more spaces. Other peers and community members I've talked to about land acknowledgements say that many of them are very obviously less about accuracy and more about doing something in the name of reconciliation without doing anything else. Stumbling over some words just isn't enough. Indigenous programming and leadership should also be consistently reflected throughout the event, workshop, or curriculum. All this is good information to keep in mind while we dissect this last and most recent article that Stuart's written about his thoughts on Indigenous land acknowledgements. Also, please read the article that I was just reading from. There's a good portion of it I didn't cover and it has some really good stuff. Stuart goes on to describe the development of his thoughts on the expanding prevalence of land acknowledgements on campus. At first, I just ignored these performative displays. They are faintly annoying and serve no practical purpose, but they struck me as basically harmless. As their appearances became more persistent, however, I began to worry that they represent affirmation of a specific ideology. As such, they constitute a flagrant violation of the institutional neutrality recommended by the University of Chicago's Calvin Report in 1967. The report was prepared by a faculty committee tasked with examining, quote, the university's role in political and social action, end quote. And it affirmed that, quote, the university's commitment to the academic freedom of faculty and students in the face of suppression from internal and/or external entities, while also insisting on institutional neutrality on political and social issues, end quote. Institutional neutrality doesn't apply here. We're talking about providing education on white colonialism and the genocide of Indigenous peoples in North America that has been woefully absent in most education programs throughout the United States. Land acknowledgements provide a bridge, albeit a small one, to understanding more about these issues. He then describes a new recommendation, not requirement, made by the Allen School's experts on diversity and what he did in response. A document of best practices for inclusive teaching produced by Allen School's diversity experts recommends the inclusion of an Indigenous land acknowledgement to course syllabi. They provide the following example. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish people of this land, the land which touches the shared water of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. In December, I sent a message to our faculty mailing list announcing that I plan to append my own version of the land acknowledgement to the syllabus for my winter course. I included the text they had in mind and made it clear that I wanted feedback because I wasn't sure it was a good idea. Nobody responded. So when classes started this week, I posted my syllabus with the following declaration under the headline, quote, Indigenous Land Acknowledgement. I acknowledge that by the labor theory of property, the Coast Salish people can claim historical ownership of almost none of the land currently occupied by the University of Washington. Now, I'll get into why I don't agree with his version of the land acknowledgement a bit later. First, he gives some context for why he wrote and believes his version of a land acknowledgement. I am a Georgist, and according to the Georgist worldview, Native Americans have no special claim to any land, just like the rest of us. But since few are familiar with that economic ideology, I leaned instead on a principle described in John Locke's second treatise? I fucking hate that word. John Locke's second treatise on government, now known as the labor theory of property or the homestead principle. To the Georgist idea that land is owned in common by all living people, Locke added that by mixing one's labor with the land, one encloses it from the shared property because people own the products of their labor. If, for example, you make the effort to grow corn on an acre of land, you come to own that acre of land, so long as there is plenty of land left for others to use. Sure, land being commonly owned by all people is nice, but that doesn't act as a blanket statement to disregard the historical context under which the land became commonly owned. Land was being actively used by the Coast Salish people in this area before it was taken from them. To delve into specifics about the history of the indigenous Coast Salish peoples, the establishment of Fort Vancouver in 1824 was important as it established a regular site of interaction with the Clackamas, Multnomah, and Cascade Chinooks, as well as interior Klickitat, Cowlitz, and Kalapuya. Parties from the Hudson's Bay Company, led by John Work, traveled the length of the central and South Georgia Strait Puget Sound. From the 1810s through 1850s, Coast Salish groups of Georgia Strait and Puget Sound experienced raiding by northern peoples, particularly the Yucatecas and the Haida. The Stevens Treaties were negotiated in 1854 to 55, but many tribes had reservations and did not participate. Others dropped out of treaty negotiations. From 1850 to 1854, the Douglas Treaties were signed on Vancouver Island between various Coast Salish peoples around Victoria and Nanaimo, and also with two Kwakwaka'wakw groups on northern Vancouver Island. The Muckleshoot Reservation was established after the Puget Sound War of 1855 to 56. After legislation amending the Indian Act was passed the previous year, in 1885 the potlatch was banned in Canada. It was banned in the U.S. some years later. This suppression ended in the U.S. in 1934 and in 1951 in Canada. Some potlatching became overt immediately. A resurgence of tribal culture began in the 1960s. National civil rights movements engendered civil action for treaty rights. This, of course, isn't even close to all of the history, which I encourage you to read, but it's enough to see that violence was enacted on the Coast Salish people. It's enough to see that treaties were signed by some, but not all tribes, meaning some of the tribes' land was, and still may be, illegally occupied. Banning traditions such as the potlatch done by indigenous peoples is an act of suppression in relation to the culture of Coast Salish people. There's a deep history of white colonialism here that has greatly diminished all Coastal Salish tribes' culture and wealth non-consensually. At the end of the day, claiming you have an ideology that land is commonly owned by all people is directly opposed with your statement that indigenous people have no special historical claim to the land. Under this doctrine you say you abide by, they should have equal claim to the land, at bare minimum. And even then, at least a portion of the land in question was taken against the will of the indigenous people here. Not only that, but you later say, but I have been unable to find much evidence that Native Americans ever made productive use of the 350 acres on which the main campus of the University of Washington now stands. So your ideology isn't actually land is commonly owned by all people, it's land is commonly owned by all people that I deem worthy to own the land, which is a bit different to say the least. In any event, it doesn't really matter whether or not my beliefs about Native American land ownership make any sense. The point is that by encouraging faculty to include a land acknowledgement, the DEI experts invited each of us to express our own opinions on the topic. After all, shouldn't a declaration be sincere? A foreseeable outcome of this approach, of course, is that some teachers will take the opportunity to express views about historical land claims and ownership that others find objectionable. But this is the whole problem with land acknowledgements in the first place, and the reason for the Kelvin Report's insistence that a university remain neutral on social issues. I mean, then what's the point? This is essentially an admission that your primary reason behind including your land acknowledgement statement in the syllabus was for the drama. This, coupled with your not so solid ideology behind the Coast Salish people not having any special claim to the land, tends to make me believe your opinions motivate your information much more than your information motivates your opinions. You could have just not included the land acknowledgement with some statement about how you think these acknowledgements should be sincere to be included, because I think that's honestly a valid point. Honestly, I think myself and Selena Mills would agree with you when you ask, after all, shouldn't a declaration be sincere? But again, instead of seeking to understand why the land acknowledgement exists, you choose the oppositional and non-conversational route of including this statement in the syllabus. He goes on to ask why it's such a big deal, why everyone's making a big fuss over it. As a professor and as an intro professor especially, I would hope it would be one of his primary goals to encourage students of all backgrounds. His articles, while detrimental for reasons already discussed, have remained up to this point on a third-party website. Now he's incorporating his opinions directly into course materials, giving students a first-hand offering of what had been previously said on online blogs. Students begin to see him as a potential opposing force to their advancement and growth and have to decide whether to take a course taught by him, wasting their time and dampening their potential enthusiasm for computer science. As he states in his article, he thinks he has an equal right to provide his opinion on land acknowledgements to counter that of the universities. To that I would say, the difference is that the university's land acknowledgement statement, while minimal, seeks to educate, naming the nations who tended to the land where the UW campus stands. Your statement seeks to, at best, make a theory-based case against land acknowledgements, and at worst dismiss the violence and conflicts involved in the seizing of this land by colonizers. Like I said earlier, Land acknowledgements are nice, but barely minimal to represent an often misrepresented time in American history, and can be changed in a few ways to make the presences more useful, such as including more historical context as to how the land was taken, education about tribes surrounding the land in question, the university providing rent to the respective tribes, etc. Stuart's opinions on land acknowledgements being instituted by the university may be valid to some extent here, but his opinions about land acknowledgements as a concept and indigenous peoples as a whole are deeply flawed. In conclusion, Reges' articles reek of having predetermined opinions. He tries to use statistics to fit those opinions, while the statistics themselves have their own implications, and generally lead to more unanswered questions than unquestioned answers. On top of that, he has consistently conflated reactionaries with valid criticisms of himself, seeking to focus on the former rather than the latter. In Why Women Don't Code, Stuart mentions that professionals and activists who work in this area tend to see it differently. For them, diversity involves a commitment to righting the wrongs of the past. Political and religious diversity are not on their list because they don't represent the immutable characteristics previously used to justify discrimination. Firstly, I don't know where you got the idea that religious diversity isn't important. I don't think anyone has said that or made that argument. Secondly, political diversity isn't on their list because some political beliefs include the rejection of minorities and women, and diversity efforts in their own right. It seems a bit counterintuitive, to me at least, for the university to incorporate those people into their diversity campaigns. Thirdly, and most importantly, you say wronging the rights of the past as if it's a bad thing. As I hope I've shown through this 15-ish hour video, the need for diversity and inclusion is brought forth by how deeply rooted discrimination has been and continues to be in our society. Women were only viewed as housewives until the early to mid-1900s. Black people were considered less than a white person legally until slavery was ended, and then they were still considered less than a white person until they were given the right to vote, a right which is being still infringed upon to this day. These aren't problems that are going to be solved and checked off a list. They're going to require continuous work to not only improve but maintain diversity until these problems are fully uprooted in our society. I would say I'm open to a sit-down discussion with Stuart, but that would be a lie. At least not in a live format. Behind the screen, I can do all the research and editing that I would ever want to do to make sure I say exactly what. And I fully understand that my inability to do so in a fraction of a second in a sit-down conversation with him would be detrimental to any potential discussion that could be had, let alone that he truly doesn't seem open to a two-way conversation, at least publicly. Live debates have always been and continue to be about winning, not legitimate discussion of issues, the latter of which I am more interested in personally. If, on the very off chance, he makes a response in a non-live format, I'd be more than happy to follow up. Here we are. Welcome to the end of the video. If you made it to the end, you truly have my utmost thanks. Thank you for having so much patience with me. It's a lot. Whether you were taking notes the whole time or had me on in the background, just working, I understand. I'll end with a short snippet from the Jordan Peterson ContraPoints video I mentioned earlier that I think describes my personal journey fairly well, and I think is something that we should all live our lives by. Bye-bye.
Rorty advocates an attitude toward knowledge he calls ironism, irony being the skeptical caution with which we should regard our own beliefs and our awareness that our vocabulary for describing and understanding the world is not the final or best vocabulary. Alright, that's enough explaining, and my nails are done. Check it out!